Imagine waking up before dawn, pulling on a damp uniform in a freezing attic room, and heading downstairs to curtsy to an empty chair. Not because anyone is sitting in it, not because a royal just walked in, but because one walked out moments ago, and the rules say the space they occupied still deserves your bow. This is not a scene from a Victorian novel. This is Balmoral Castle, and for hundreds of workers over the past century and a half, it has been their daily reality. Balmoral sits deep in the Scottish Highlands, tucked behind a single winding road that cuts through pine forests and open moorland. From the outside, it looks exactly like what it is, a fairy tale made of granite. The white stone sparkles when the light hits it right, the hills roll green and purple behind it, and the whole estate breathes a kind of ancient, untouchable calm. But behind those thick walls, behind the carefully polished silver and the perfectly starched linens, something far less romantic has been quietly unfolding for generations. Workers have been leaving, not one or two at a time, not reluctantly, with heavy hearts and a last look over their shoulders. They have been walking out in groups, some overnight, some without warning, some after years of silence, finally reaching a breaking point they could no longer push past. To understand why, you have to go back to where it all began. Prince Albert bought Balmoral in 1852, reportedly after spotting an advertisement in a newspaper. He paid a sum that would be worth several £1,000,000 today, and he did not even tell Queen Victoria right away. Within a few years, the original house was demolished, and a new granite castle rose in its place, completed in 1856. Albert was deeply involved in the design. He sketched elements himself, ensured the windows captured the Highland air, and had carvings of all 9 of his children placed near the entrance. The hallways were made deliberately narrow, a personal touch meant to encourage chance encounters between family members. The clock tower was modeled after a German castle and tuned to ring in E-flat, so the horses in the stables would not be startled. It was, in almost every sense, a private vision made real. And that word, private, would come to define everything about Balmoral, not just for the royal family, but for every single person who ever worked there. The estate grew steadily after Albert's death, eventually covering more than 50,000 acres. It had its own power supply, its own timber operations, its own staff villages, and for a time, its own private railway line used to transport royal luggage discreetly through the mountains. Parliament occasionally raised questions about the estate status as personal property rather than public heritage, but those voices were brushed aside. Balmoral was the family's refuge, and the family intended to keep it that way. When revenues came in from renting cottages or selling timber or hosting tours, that money stayed within the household. The public had no claim on it, and the workers who made it all run had very little claim either. The labor structure at Balmoral has always carried the fingerprints of a different century. During peak season, close to 150 workers live on the estate. There are gamekeepers and gillies, horse handlers and cooks, cleaners and footmen and groundskeepers. There is, famously, a piper whose sole job has been to play the bagpipes beneath the royal window at 7 in the morning. Every one of these workers signs a confidentiality agreement, and in more recent decades, those agreements have been tied to legal consequences serious enough to silence almost anyone. For the maids and room attendants, the work has historically been among the most physically demanding on the estate. In earlier decades, vacuum cleaners were banned entirely because the noise was considered disruptive. 2 maids would spend 45 minutes on their hands and knees brushing a single hallway with horsehair brushes. The dust accumulated so quickly that their aprons had to be rinsed twice a day. When a former head housekeeper calculated the time added to daily routines as a result of this rule, she estimated it at 9 additional hours of labor. The pay did not change. Junior maids in the 1980s were earning wages that barely cleared the national average, despite working weeks of 60 hours or more and living full-time on the estate. The physical demands were compounding too. Those who spent years on their knees developed lasting wrist and joint problems. Workers in the upper attic rooms, which were not properly heated until the mid-1990s, dealt with temperatures that dropped to near freezing at night. Some developed respiratory illnesses. At least 2 were dismissed for missing work due to illness they had developed on the job. The rules governing behavior were strict in ways that went beyond professional conduct and into something closer to psychological management. Staff were not permitted to speak unless addressed by a royal. They were not permitted to react to anything they overheard. If a maid was dusting a room and caught a fragment of a private conversation, the correct response was to pretend deafness. Doing otherwise, even making accidental eye contact at the wrong moment, could result in a written warning. 2 warnings meant dismissal and the loss of an end-of-season bonus that, for many workers, represented a significant portion of their annual income. Some workers developed informal sign language systems to communicate during service, particularly at breakfast. The halls were quieter than a library, as one account described it, but not out of reverence. The silence was maintained through fear, and everyone in it understood that distinction perfectly well. The curtsy rule deserves particular attention because it sits at the intersection of tradition and dignity in a way that many former workers found difficult to process. The requirement to bow to a room an occupant has just vacated is old, older than anyone currently working at Balmoral. It was designed as an expression of ongoing respect for the royal presence, a way of acknowledging that even the space a member of the family has moved through carries a kind of significance. In theory, it is a formality. In practice, it became something workers privately described as one of the most dehumanizing aspects of the job, not because the gesture itself is so demanding, but because of what it represents. The idea that the physical space a royal has occupied is more deserving of acknowledgement than the physical body of the person doing the bowing. During busy periods, particularly around the annual Gillies Ball held every September, some maids performed this curtsy dozens of times in a single evening, including to rooms that had been empty for several minutes. The cumulative physical toll was real. Workers with knee injuries carried on, because stopping was not an option. The Gillies Ball itself is one of Balmoral's most genuinely unusual traditions, and workers' accounts of it are notably mixed. The event has been held each September since 1858 and brings together royals and staff for an evening of Scottish country dancing. The reigning monarch opens the dancing, and staff members of every level are included. Invitations are graded by rank, gold-edged for senior or more trusted staff, plain for others. And at midnight, the royals depart and everyone present bows or curtsies in silence. For one evening a year, first names are permitted. For one evening a year, the hierarchy softens at its edges. Many workers over the years have described the ball with genuine warmth. It represented a moment of recognition, a night when their presence was acknowledged as something other than instrumental. But others have noted the complicated feeling of a single annual evening of inclusion set against 51 weeks of strict invisibility. The contrast, rather than softening the harder realities of working life, sometimes made them sharper. Pay has been, consistently, one of the most documented grievances. Payroll records that became public in 2024 revealed a pay gap inside the royal household that shocked people outside it. Senior aides were earning figures well above the national average. Maids and room attendants were earning figures well below it, in some cases around £19,000 annually, with the expectation that they would share living quarters on the estate. The ratio between the highest and lowest earners in the household was more than 7-1. This gap existed against a backdrop of growing estate revenues. After the death of Queen Elizabeth II, visitor numbers and tourism income across royal properties increased significantly. Analysts who reviewed publicly available estate accounts noted that closing the wage gap for frontline staff would have required a fraction of the income generated by that tourism surge. The cost of raising wages to fair levels was estimated to be less than the annual budget for resurfacing the private helicopter landing pad. That comparison, once it circulated, became a focal point for public frustration. The 2024 Indeed review posted by a former housekeeper described an environment where supervisors shouted at staff in front of guests, where missing dust on an antique picture frame resulted in dock break time, and where workers regularly exceeded their legally protected working hours without additional compensation. The post attracted dozens of responses from other former employees within days. The palace issued a statement disputing the characterization, but did not address the specific pay figures. The mass walkout at Highgrove Estate in the summer of 2025 drew significant attention because of its scale and its timing. Out of 12 gardeners on the estate, 11 left within a matter of weeks. The final trigger was a workplace injury. A gardener tore his shoulder hauling heavy loads alone and found himself placed on statutory sick pay, a fraction of his normal earnings. His colleagues, already stretched thin by working practices that prohibited the use of tractors and required everything to be done by hand in service of the estate's environmental commitments, reached a collective decision that the conditions were no longer sustainable. The environmental vision behind those conditions was not without genuine intention. The push toward organic, carbon-neutral practices across the royal estates represented a considered philosophical position about land stewardship. But the implementation placed the entire physical cost of that vision onto workers who were being paid minimum wage to carry it out, sometimes literally by hand and wheelbarrow, across 15 or more acres of maintained garden. Handwritten notes pinned to the potting shed wall demanded changes by sunrise or full replanting done within 72 hours. The gap between the ambition of the instructions and the physical reality of fulfilling them was one that workers absorbed with their bodies. The pattern of workers speaking out, facing consequences, and then watching the institution carry on largely unchanged runs like a thread through Balmoral's entire modern history. In 1950, a woman who had spent 16 years as governess to the young princesses published a memoir describing relatively gentle, humanizing accounts of royal childhood. She lost her grace and favor cottage. She was cut off completely. She died decades later, having spent years trying to repair a reputation that had been systematically dismantled. Not one member of the family attended her funeral. Later accounts came with legal consequences attached. A valet who published a memoir in the early 2000s received legal correspondence within 24 hours of the book reaching the public. The legal machinery available to the royal household has always been significantly more powerful than anything available to a former maid or cleaner, and workers understood this. The confidentiality agreements signed since the late 1980s explicitly included reference to official secrets legislation in some cases, lending them a weight that went beyond civil contract into something closer to a criminal deterrent. Even accounts published with explicit royal permission were not entirely safe. A dresser who received the Queen's blessing to write about her years of service found herself at the center of internal palace disagreement about whether certain photographs were appropriate. The message absorbed by those watching from inside the institution was clear. There was no version of honesty about working life at Balmoral that came without risk. What makes the recent departures different from earlier ones is scale and visibility. Social media changed the landscape of whistleblowing in ways that palace communications teams were not fully prepared for. A maid posting screenshots of a denied emergency leave request to a public forum, with her mother going into surgery and a supervisor telling her the royal linens needed starching, was not the same as a former servant giving an interview to a French magazine in 1988. The post went viral within days. Thousands of people commented. The human detail of it, the specificity of 10 unused leave days, the intimacy of a daughter trying to reach a dying mother, the institutional coldness of the response, cut through in a way that decades of formal complaints and parliamentary debates had not. 2 weeks after that post circulated, a new job listing appeared for a room attendant position at the estate. The palace called it a coincidence. People who had been following the story were less convinced. What Balmoral represents, in its grandest interpretation, is continuity. It is a place where a family has returned every year for more than a century and a half, where the same hills and rivers and stone hallways connect generation to generation across an extraordinary span of history. The attachment is real. The meaning is real. The rituals, the ball, the hunt, the piping at dawn, even the narrow hallways designed to bring a family closer together, carry genuine emotional weight for those who belong to them. But that continuity has a cost, and it has always been paid by people whose names do not appear in the history books. The maid who brushed the carpet before the Queen walked across it. The gardener who replanted 700 flowers in 3 days. The young woman who curtsied to an empty room 61 times in one evening and iced her knees afterward. The footman who learned sign language to communicate with colleagues during breakfast service because speaking aloud was too dangerous. Their stories are not spectacular in the way that royal stories are spectacular. They do not involve abdication speeches or affairs or diplomatic crises. They involve freezing bedrooms and damp uniforms and wrist pain and the particular loneliness of being told, directly or indirectly, that your dignity matters less than the tradition you are serving. The maids who left Balmoral Castle did not leave because the work was hard. Hard work in itself is not what breaks people. They left because the hardness of the work was invisible to the institution asking them to do it. They left because the gap between what was expected of them and what was offered in return, in money, in recognition, in basic human dignity, had grown too wide to bridge with loyalty alone. They left because loyalty, it turns out, is not actually its own reward. And in leaving, they said something that generations of signed confidentiality agreements had been designed to prevent them from saying, that what happens behind those granite walls is not just the private business of a private family. It is the business of every person who ever laced up a pair of stiff shoes before dawn and walked down a cold stone hallway to make someone else's world beautiful.